Before I wore glasses.
Madam Mayor, it's 6 o'clock and we're live.
Good evening, everyone. I'd like to call this Thursday, January 10th, City Commission LDR work session to order and ask the clerk to call the roll, please.
Mayor Pam Triolo.
Here.
Vice Mayor Andy Amoroso.
Here.
Commissioner Scott Maxwell.
Here.
Commissioner Omari Hardy.
Here.
Commissioner Herman Robinson.
Here.
If everyone would please rise for the pledge, led by the Vice Mayor.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, we're going to hop right in. Updates, future action, direction. Item 3A, Land Development Regulations, Section 23.3-6, Use Tables. Starting the presentation will be, please announce yourself.
Dun, dun, dun. Mayor, Commissioners, Mark Stivers with Department of Community Sustainability. We are going to be walking through tonight in this workshop, looking at the use table, and then we're going to get into looking at specifically going down the landscape code sections of this. So we'll jump right in and go down the use table. So I want to start by being very clear that there are
Quiet in the chambers, please.
I wanted to start
I can hear them from here.
by saying that is that quiet enough, Mayor?
No, you're good.
Man in the back in the purple shirt. What we are bringing forward is a lot of maintenance type items, or cleanup, if you will, of these code sections that we have been looking at for a long time now. You did see a version of this when we brought the larger land development ordinance amendment before you. We ran into some questions, and Madam Mayor, I believe it was you that asked that we bring the use table back as a workshop, work through it in detail. And then once we get to a version that we all like, we'll bring it back to you as an ordinance for your formal action.
Correct.
So I'm going to go down through this, explain to you basically what we are looking at, and if you will, on the dais before you, you have a color-coded version of this table. So I'm going to be referring to that most of the presentation because I think that helps clarify exactly what's going on with this table. Because the way that we have to do it is you strike out something, you're deleting or moving, and you have to underline something that's being added. And it looks like we're adding a lot of uses to this table, but in reality, all we're doing is reorganizing it and moving it from one classification to another, consolidating some of the uses down, getting rid of redundancies. And in few places we had a use listed in more than one category with different criteria, and has caused some confusion. So we want to make sure that everything is listed once in the appropriate location and in the appropriate zoning districts.
Mark, are you adding anything, just for people at home's reference? Are
We're
you
not-
adding anything, or are you just reclassifying and moving to the right areas?
We have not added any uses
Okay,
to this,
that's what I
but
meant.
we've changed some of the status of a couple of the uses, and
Gotcha.
we'll go through that. But
Okay.
we're not adding uses to this table.
I just wanted to.
And that's why I want to be painfully clear on that, because there are some areas that the words are underlined, and that in code language means we're adding it. But it's not a new use. It's just a use that may have been in one category and is now being reorganized into a new category. It is not a new use.
So for example, again, just for clarification, say if an item that you see underlined was in medium intensity artisanal uses, and you've moved it to high intensity artisanal uses,
It'll show as underlined.
it'll show as crossed out in the former category and underlined in the present category.
That is correct.
Thank you.
Okay. So we have looked at the big changes. We are looking at modifying the industrial uses, and I'll jump right into that one first. So if you jump to that tab, and I'm going to go ahead and jump over to the table. Here's how we've color coded everything, so you can see exactly what's going on. Anything that's in purple is just a consolidation of existing uses. Anything that's listed in green is just an existing use that's being located to a different category. And again, we deal in this stuff every day of the week. We speak a different language than most humans, I get it. I want to be clear that there's a difference between categories and zoning districts. We say there is a residential category, a commercial category, an industrial category, and then across the top of the table are all the different zoning districts that actually implement those things, okay? So when I'm talking categories, I'm talking about the broader artisanal, commercial, residential. When we talk about zoning districts, that's the specific regulation, okay? So if we go, and one of the big changes for us, and this I'll say it's for me, is we've alphabetized these now, both in the different categories are all alphabetized, and within each category we've alphabetized the uses, so you'll see that as well. So in the industrial uses, one of the changes staff is recommending is that as we are trying to bring jobs into the city and we're trying to incentivize the Park of Commerce, we realize that any use that's going into a building over 7,500 square feet, for the most part, requires a conditional use. And it makes a lot of sense because as you're getting a bigger impact, we want to have a little more control over what you're coming into. However, we're seeing that in the industrial district, a lot of the buildings, a lot of the spaces are over 7,500 square feet, and we're taking uses that we want to see in that district and making them pay an application fee and go through a public process for a use that we're trying to encourage here. So we're suggesting that we modify this section and make a lot of these uses permitted uses. If they are making changes to the site, they still have to come in for either a minor or a major site plan, but the use itself would not have to go through a conditional use process. And again, we're hoping to make this change to incentivize this district, okay? The other change that we are looking at is in residential. If you look in the residential district, most of the uses or types of housing are permitted by right. Except for townhouses, and all townhouses required a conditional use. So we're saying let's make townhouses consistent with apartments, and for you guys it's on page
15.
13. Okay.
Well, it's 13 on the big one,
Yeah.
15 on this one.
Okay. But make townhouses a use by right as well, so they'd be permitted use, because we want to encourage and incentivize that type of housing here in the city.
Why would that have been excluded if apartments or condominiums or whatever
Well,
else
you
are
get a
not?
history on why they went.
For the most part, William Waters, Community Sustainability Director, for the most part, multifamily properties were of a size that threw them in the conditional use category anyway, even though they were permitted by right. With townhomes, because they are lots of record and are individual homes and how they're developed, there were additional standards that were desired in their approval process, so they were made a conditional use during the discussions back in 2011 and 12. This is in developing the LDRs originally, but you all approved in the August of 2013. So there's additional standards that a townhouse project had to meet that a traditional single-family home or an apartment complex would not have had to meet.
Okay.
Okay, so that makes sense?
Yes.
So those are the two changes that are of any substance that staff is recommending. The rest of the table, if you go down through it, you'll see it's color coded. It really is reorganizing and consolidating uses down. And I can go line by line, we can get into details, but I'll let you guys direct if there's specific issues you want to get into, because I don't see any need to get into stuff that's not a question to you guys. Is there anything you want to go over or look at in this slide?
Vice Mayor?
I just had a couple things highlighted that I didn't catch when we talked earlier, but I'd like to put it out for public. So on the backup justification. It says allow nursing homes, assisted living facilities, and additional zoning districts. Was there a problem with that? Did we have issues with where our nursing homes are, or do we have additional nursing homes looking to go into areas that may not be zoned for that?
The idea was, this is one of the uses that was listed in two different areas. In one area, assisted living was allowed in more districts and zones than it was in the residential. And the other is that we're just seeing that it's a use that seems compatible with all these. So it's not like there's a demand or a push for it. It just seems like it's a compatible use in those districts.
Okay. And then remove automobile service and repair automobile sales from MU-DH. Where are we? Is that Dixie Highway? Is it the industrial area? Where are we cleaning that up?
Off of Dixie Highway.
Okay.
And I believe the direction we've been talking about for a while is getting some of these higher intensity automotive uses off of the major thoroughfares, off of Dixie Highway, out of that zoning district, and allowing it industrial in our artisanal industrial zones where we feel like they're more appropriate.
And we've already done that, because from what I remember is, if you're an existing automotive on Dixie Highway, you could sell your existing, but once it's closed for a certain period of time, it can no longer be, and it would be rezoned.
Yeah, and we have, for sales of vehicles, we have lot area requirements, and so we're making it so that not that it's more difficult to get in, but those kind of uses go in the appropriate places.
And then going down, add certain uses, additional intensity categories. For example, coffee shops currently only permitted in low end. Where are we thinking? I think we talked about extending on the west side. Is that what we're talking about?
We're talking more, and again, this is where, and I'll go to the commercial one. We're even looking at retail. The categories are high, medium, and low intensity, and some of the uses that are allowed in a lower intensity district may not be allowed in medium and high. And what we're saying is, if you have a building that's under 2,500 square feet, you can have a coffee shop. But if you have a building that's 7,500 square feet and you want a coffee shop with a lot of extra tables in the same zoning district, it wouldn't be allowed. We're just saying, let's walk some of these things up the intensity categories within the same zoning district to allow them in places where we already do, but maybe at a larger size.
And would that include the areas that we're talking about in the downtown corridor and also west, the 1 block, 2 block radius, both north and south, to allow, a coffee shop or a little cafe or something to come into one of these little homes like on M Street that we did years ago?
The mixed-use east category, which does include the areas north of First Avenue South and south of Second Avenue North, would facilitate that. It's also mentioned in the cultural arts overlay that can happen. But again, keep in mind that when you convert a residential property to commercial uses, the building code does kick in, and it has been a challenge for people wanting to convert those residential structures to commercial uses.
Yeah, I'm just trying to keep it clear, but that was our biggest challenge was, at $50,000-$60,000 to bring one of the smaller homes up to ADA standards and code in order to accommodate, letting the public in. So, okay, thank you.
Commissioner Hardy?
One observation, the other thing is that this automobile service repair and automobile sales will be removed from the artisanal industrial zoning district as well, right? So that means that maybe one day while you're having a beer at a local brewery, you'll no longer have to hear lug nuts being screwed and things like that.
That's the goal.
Is that the basic
and
idea?
Specifically in that district, absolutely. We're trying to change that whole area of the city
Precisely.
to make it a different feel. Say it that way.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Okay. And then the other thing is about that last bit about little homes being able to be used for commercial purposes. Just a quick question: would historic preservation would they have any protections if it's a contributing structure? Like let's say I have a contributing structure and it's a home and it's in like the mixed use district, right? And I'm taking it from residential commercial. Does the fact that it's contributing kind of exempt it from some of those things, like blowing out the bathroom and all of these things like that?
You're sort of mixing two things. One is that the interior uses of a structure are not governed by the Historic Preservation Code.
Okay.
Now, when you're converting from, or when you're staying within the same use like residential, there are exemptions in the building code for existing buildings and also historically designated buildings such as contributing ones.
Right.
When you are changing from a certain use or occupancy, let's say from residential to commercial, there are a few exemptions, but you can't get around ADA
Okay.
and you can't get around bathroom counts. And if your occupancy load goes from 3 people to 30 people, you're going to have to do something. That's has nothing to do with historic preservation.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
And under the automotive classifications, there were numerous ones. So whether you were a company that replaced windshield wipers, or you were a tire person, or you were a car salesperson, or whatever, there were there was many of them. So now they're all kind of lumped into certain classifications.
And we grouped a lot of them into 2 broad categories: automotive, major, and minor. So minor is defined as those uses that are daily maintenance repair things. Your glass repair, some minor body work, looking at replacing parts that are to be replaced. Major gets anything into the engine drivetrain, you're doing that kind of work. And we say those are the 2 major categories. How you break it down in your business model of those things, I don't think as important. So, and a lot of them are allowed in the same districts anyway. So we're like, it's redundancy in the code. Let's just consolidate them down.
Okay.
Just to edify too, that one reason why it's kind of the way it is that way back when we had our previous, we did not have a permitted use table in our previous land development code. And one of the things we struggle with is that our business tax receipt schedule has all these uses in it. And we try to keep the ones and have it be commensurate, hoping that the state would let us reevaluate and do a business tax receipt study to bring the uses up to current date. Well, we waited now 8 years since I've been here and not been able to do that. They won't allow us, so we are just going to go ahead and do what we had hoped to do numerous years ago by consolidating things, and then we're just going to have to work together to figure out what category under the BTR things fall, because that category that we now have may not exist on that schedule.
I remember a while back, William, and you and I talked about this too today, Mark. There was, I remember in the Park of Commerce area, there was a lot of businesses that were looking to rent bays from several of the property owners, and they were having a hard time finding the classification, so-called classification that they came under. Have we cleared that up to make it easier in that area?
What we did, I believe, Nancy Stroud helped us do a amendment to the LDRs where we went to something that we further defined the classifications that are in the permitted use table and brought in some language that describes something that's substantially similar, because we have an inclusionary code. So if it's not specifically mentioned, it's by default not allowed. So we opened it up and provided a definition whereby if the use was substantially similar to those that are in that use category, staff would be able to allow them.
Okay, so it's a staff approval on that. I remember.
Not necessarily staff approval, it's a staff interpretation of the use.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Robinson? I see you reaching.
Well, you got under vehicular limited dockage. Can you tell me what how much wordage there is in verbiage or whatever there is in that?
Sorry, what are you asking for? I see
The
the use.
explanation of limited dockage.
What page?
It's under medium intensity vehicular
Medium
uses.
intensity, it's on the chart, it's right here. I can tell you that's a use I've never used. It's in the ordinance now. I can tell you, I'm not, do you know what that is, William? The limited dockage.
It's under medium intensity
Right here.
vehicular
Yes.
uses.
Well, it was referring back a while ago to the boat issue,
What boat issue?
like recreational boats and where they can be temporarily docked.
Okay.
It goes back to that.
So we're just talking water.
Not necessarily,
Dry dock.
yeah. If someone could bring in a boat and possibly work on it like they do at Rybovich, it could be temporarily docked at a dock at a property. It doesn't have a clear definition. We did not, I don't recall improving or,
Is it under
what it was
public?
getting around is that there's certain instances where a boat might, I think Riviera Beach fell into this, and maybe Christy has some history, I know she does, where the boat becomes a permanent fixture and someone lives on it forever. We specifically here, and I don't know where it came from, it was part of Lake Forest history. If we had dockage, it was going to be on a limited part-time basis, not permanent. Some of the history of stuff I don't know, and I haven't really investigated it overly too much because
And the other question was charging stations. Where did I see charging stations? Are they gonna be a problem?
It's moved somewhere. Where did you move automobile charging stations? You moved it from low intensity vehicular to what?
Yeah, we just changed the name from what it was automobile to vehicular. So instead of an automobile charging station, it's a vehicular charging station. It's not going to be a problem. And quite often, they're not a principal use. They come as also as an accessory use to things. So we'll work with people to get them in. Absolutely.
Okay. Commissioner Hardy?
Yes. This has come up before, and I'm wondering, frankly, if we have too many of them. And I'm wondering if the ones that we have too much parking, and those would be banks in the downtown on Lake and Lucerne, right? So we have, for example, a bank that came in recently, and it has lots of parking, and then in a lot across the street from it, it has a drive-through that could probably be used for some other productive uses. So just for example, between Second Avenue and Second Avenue North and First Avenue South, between Dixie Highway and Gulfview, I can think of 5 banks, and they take up a lot of land. And I'm wondering, do we want any more? And if we don't want any more, whether they should be allowed really at all between Second and First, between Dixie and Gulfview, whether it's mixed use east, the 2 different versions of mixed use east here, and the downtown zoning, or Dixie Highway.
And that is a very common discussion among cities and towns like this. And I would look to you guys and say, if that's a policy you want us to put into place, then we can look at either a separation distance or say no more banks within a downtown area. If you want to move that forward, we can look at that. Absolutely.
We had a conversation about tattoo parlors, and also we had a conversation about medical marijuana. And with medical marijuana, for example, for the entire city, we said 2's enough, right? And this doesn't have the stigma associated with medical marijuana,
Right.
And it doesn't have the stigma associated with tattoos. But I'm wondering if there are 5 banks that I can think of, and there's another bank property that used to be a bank, so that would be 6 total properties that have been or are devoted to banking within such a short or small area. Is 5 or 6 enough for a very, very small downtown? And one of the reasons why, I'm wondering, and I've had conversations with the city manager, and maybe some of these things are mythic, about why we have banks in other towns near us across the water don't have that concentration of banks in such a small area, and whether or not we should allow ourselves to be the dumping ground for this not extraordinarily productive use when it has the amount of parking that it does in a downtown that thrives on human beings, rather than storage for vehicles.
I'm good. If the commission wants us to go that way, we can work up language to do that. I have no problem with that.
I would.
Just caution on the fact of, number one, I've been consistent in that I don't like to discourage business of any kind to investing in our community. But if you would rather look at the footprint as you started your conversation with, because there are many banks, especially if you have mixed-use buildings coming in with residential components and whatever, there are many small footprint banks that open up in downstairs, the main floor units of mixed-use residential and properties that wouldn't have their own parking places, that would be inclusive of the parking of that mixed-use property. So I think to limit a business as opposed to, or to look into the more of the impact of it rather than, I don't know if you could do that or not do that.
So we have uses, and the way the table works now is it's by size of the building, and maybe you could say banks are allowed as low or medium intensity, but not high intensity in those areas. Therefore, they can only be a certain size.
Maybe another way to do it is we can allow banks only if they have some sort of a shared parking arrangement with, if it's a part of a larger building and there's shared parking.
William is smiling, so I'm sure he has
well,
something to offer
the
that
building,
what's
but yeah.
illegal and not.
financial institutions and banks could probably be a bit of a workshop subject of their own. The bank you're mentioning with the drive-through on the opposite property was forced through the Planning and Zoning Board to the commission at every cost. That bank went through 29 different site plan versions. And at the time, this is right at 8 years ago, the direction to staff was figure out how to make this happen because it was the first commercial investment in downtown since Publix. Once it was built and the LDRs came, the provision for financial institutions in downtown was they can be allowed but shall not have drive-throughs.
Yeah.
And our parking requirement for banks is not that great. Chase Bank came in and requested a change because they wanted to build a new bank. Staff did not recommend that go that route, but the provision was changed to allow banks only to have drive-throughs. And then we moved forward, and then we allowed drive-throughs for other small entities west of Dixie Highway, which is how we got the drive-through for Starbucks. And so there has been a history of kind of flopping around as to drive-throughs are okay, drive-throughs are not. So we might have a discussion of more what is the ultimate desire and appeal and physical experience we want to have downtown, and whether drive-throughs of any kind are appropriate or not, because there are a number of things that fall under a bank that are basically not really open to the public, but they are significant offices. Many of the entities along Royal Palm Way in Palm Beach are banks. They're very nice offices, they pay very high taxes, but they're not open to the public. They're trust managements, but they qualify as a bank.
Right.
Now, the question I have for you is, well, first of all, some of these banks have actually qualified for extra parking in the downtown, especially at night because they're operational. And with our lack of parking, those parking lots have become backup parking scenarios for us when we desperately needed them too. So just to note that too. Vice Mayor?
I'm gonna change the subject just a little bit. Omari might.
Do you want?
Well, just
Commissioner Hardy?
yeah. I wonder if there's a way in our code to differentiate between, for example, retail banks, right, where people are coming in from the street to have basically retail services, and for example, investment banks or brokerage houses or places like what you see, for example, on Baker's Row, right, in Palm Beach. Clearly, I think there's a difference there. The issue that I have is we have lots of banks because there are certain places that don't allow banks, and they just kind of, it's like a waterbed. You don't allow it over here, it comes over here, and that's what's been happening. The other thing is, and I understand people sometimes use these bank parking lots as overflow parking, but the problem is they still have the risk of being towed. And it's not really something that's been formalized, and sometimes people shy away from parking in them when they could because of the fear of getting towed. I would love for the city to, for example, strike agreements with these banks to lease these parking spaces, but that's another issue. The problem that I have is that while there are probably other cities that have much larger parking requirements for banks, I still think these banks have really, really, really large parking areas, and I often see a lot of these parking spaces go unused. I think the Bank of America is an exception, but the TD Bank, I rarely see all those parking spots filled. Same thing with Wells Fargo across Federal Highway. Same thing for the new Chase Bank. And so I'm wondering if we can differentiate between types of financial institutions, and I'm wondering if we can bar a type of financial institution on the basis of its footprint. And I think that's a good discussion to have, Madam Mayor. I certainly would like us to have a conversation about that, if not this evening, in the future, because I certainly wouldn't want to see another one come in.
We've also had a provision in the code that prohibited anyone from doing a development that allowed any more parking than was required by code. That was repealed and taken out of the code. So if you may be required to have 4 spaces, if you want to build 29 spaces and it fits on your site, you can do that. That's another option looking at, because it's been discussed since I've been here that we don't have enough parking. So why do we have a limit on how many parking spaces you can provide on your site if you want as many as you can get? So that's another piece that we could talk about at a different time as well.
Okay.
And
Did you want to follow up on that? Because I know you said you wanted to switch topics. You
okay.
were next to go. Did you want to?
Well, I was just going to say that if a bank wants to have, I don't want to say excess parking, but we should be allowing that too. And then somehow incentivize through insurance or some sort of after-hours use of those parking spaces downtown. That's all
Incentivize, not mandate.
I agree with William that we should, possibly have a sidebar, a separate conversation about banks. But I'd also like, if we're going to have that conversation, to add in conversation about nonprofits, about, and I haven't had time to speak to the attorneys for the new year yet, but not necessarily stopping. Identifying, we have large concentrations of churches that are off the tax rolls, that are not, in my opinion, utilized. They have large amounts of parking. We're talking kind of the same situations, but maybe putting a moratorium on them temporarily, just to allow us to get everything else in place, to see what our development looks like. So I just wanted to plant that seed that if we're going to have the conversation about banks, maybe include nonprofits.
Vice Mayor Pro Tem?
Thank you. I was going to mention the nonprofits myself, but also I think it's time to move on and move on to the rest of the meeting. Get off this subject.
Commissioner Hardy, last shot.
Yeah, I'll just say Dorothy Jacks was here not too long ago. She was asked a question about nonprofits specifically, and she told us in that meeting, and I'd be happy to look at the video again, that we do not have a concentration of nonprofits that is larger than any other city in Palm Beach County. That was what the property tax appraiser for Palm Beach County said about nonprofits.
Vice Mayor Pro Tem?
Just want to get an answer to my request to close this conversation and move on.
Okay, you got it. Moving on.
Thank you.
Thank you.
But I do want to take a second to acknowledge the staff that's here. Kevin Fisher and Alexis Rosenberg have done a phenomenal job working on this, and I just want to give them credit in this meeting to say that we've been tracking this for a while. They've been working on it a long time, and they've done a huge amount of work to get it to this point.
Thanks for the cleanup. We needed that. All right, we'll
Alexis
move
gets full credit for the color coding of this.
on. Yay! We can actually read it. Thank you so much. All right, moving on to landscape.
Right.
It is proposed amendment to section 23.6-1 landscape regulations.
So this is an item that we had brought before you earlier, and we were asked to bring it back again. So we've made some changes to this ordinance as we bring it forward to you tonight. Should it be approved tonight to move forward to an ordinance, I want to start out by saying that our goal, for clarity's sake, it would be to bring forward an ordinance that would be repealing the current code section and replacing it with a new one. The reason we want to do that is we're making so many changes to the organization and structure of this, that to have them go in and edit manually all these sections is more cost prohibitive when we go to codify it than simply repealing this old code and inserting the new one in. But if it comes to you that way, what will be a companion piece to that in your backup would be a complete detailed strike through underline, so you know exactly what's changing as these codes move forward. So the one we have before you tonight for the workshop does show these strikeout underlines, so you guys can see the changes clearly that are being proposed as we move forward, okay? So, as with the previous one, there is a large section of this that has been issues that we have found over time that need to be adjusted and cleaned up and brought into consistency with other sections of the code. So that's what brought it to our attention to get working on this and to recommend these changes to you as we come forward. So there's two main sections of the code that we are looking at tonight, and then the first one is adjusting some of the definition sections, and the second one is getting into Article 6, which is the actual landscape code. So we'll go down through the definitions first, but PowerPoint's out of There you go. Okay, so in the ordinance, and you have in front of you on page 4, you'll see that we are making some recommendations to the definition section, and the important ones that we're making is, one, defining trees by the types of trees, small, medium, and large, defining what a shade tree is, and then doing some cleanup of wording. One thing that I'll say this every time I come before you, when you're in a definition section, I like to have uses grouped together. So you have tree, comma, something rather than whatever tree. Otherwise it gets scattered all over the definition section. So as we bring these different changes to you, as one of the things we'll try to be consistent on is cleaning up the definition section. One of the other changes in this we're looking at is for the purposes of chapter 23, we want to make sure that we're defining major thoroughfares consistently. So we're recommending taking out the lettered streets in downtown from the major thoroughfare definitions in chapter 23 to be consistent with how we've been applying it. So that is one change we're bringing forward here. Any questions on that part of it?
Nope.
Do you guys want me to just rock through it and ask questions at the end? Is that
Yeah.
easier?
Sounds good.
Okay. So the next big section, and you're on in your copy in front of you on page 6, is talking about the applicability section, subsection B, and you'll see that we have taken out about the second half of that, and 2 reasons. One, the first sentence states that this section of the code applies to all existing and newly developed public and private buildings, developments, and land within the incorporated areas of the city. The second section then breaks it down to another subsection, which becomes duplicative of what we've already said, that this section applies to everything. That second section, I think, was put in there to really get into when permits are required, but it got into the applicability of the entire chapter, and it created some confusion. So when we say the chapter applies to everything, and we'll get back down to subsection G, and we start talking about permits specifically and when permits are required, because that was one of the issues that both of the boards we took to and the commission both had a concern over, is when the threshold is crossed that an applicant would have to apply for a permit and go through all the cost of doing a full site plan for landscaping.
Residential.
Yeah.
Residential. Okay. Yes, that's what we had consensus on that.
Okay.
Yeah.
On the next page, page 7, in the version you had previously, we had looked at increasing the number of points required for different lots, and we really looked at those increases that we had brought forward. We realized that that's going to create an excessive burden on some of these lots. And the point system is a great way to look at it, because you put in a tree, you get 10 points. You put in a shrub, you're getting 2 points. So you're looking at encouraging a variety of landscaping on a site, but with the attempting to increase those point values, we realized it was creating an overburden on the property owners. We took it back to the way it is currently in the code. So that was a change from the last time you saw this, to bring it up this way. Okay, so we're leaving it. We decided to leave it the way it is with the points that were in the code currently. That makes sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. On page 8, line 260, we deal with duplexes to ensure that duplexes and require hedging, and 1 shade tree is required for each unit, so that we are encouraging the use of shade trees in the front yards on these properties, but clarifying that for duplexes it shall be on both sides of the property. Okay, so a duplex requires 2 shade trees. A clarification, if you're going on the same page down to line 271, we want to make it sure that people understand that with the sustainable bonus program, going above and beyond the landscaping requirements here can be used in that sustainability program towards your points, your credit in that program.
Vice Mayor?
No, I thought we were just asking questions at the end, so
We were.
okay, I'm in line for the end.
Okay.
Good. I will bring up on that page, there are two sections that are highlighted for you. In the last time we brought this forward, there was questions on whether palm trees should or should not be used as the required shade trees. The previous version, we added language that said that palm trees shall not be used as a substitute for required shade trees along public rights of way. This current version shows that as struck out. I'm looking for direction from this board as to how we want to go with the use of palms along the major thoroughfares, along right-of-ways, and their application as shade trees. So when we get to that point, I'm looking for direction on that, okay? On the next page, starting at 307, we are looking at encouraging multi-tiered plantings, and this is just an additional criteria that Dave has been looking at for a while to bring in to encourage appropriate location of landscaping on a site and appropriate placement of these things. If you look at a site that has nice shrubs in the front, you get taller and trees in the back, it's a great presentation, a great way to look at it. So we want to just make that a regulation as we're going forward. And David, at this point, I should ask you, anything you want to jump in on, please just holler and jump in, all right? Okay, the next, going through page 10, 11, we just have a lot of little cleanup language issues. There's nothing really substantive in these sections that we need to dive into. If you go on to page 12, and we're getting into lines 443 on down, we are adding additional criteria for maintenance and pruning of trees and maintenance and pruning of palms to ensure that the trees and the canopy that we have here in the city is protected and maintained as we go forward. Okay? Quite often we see people coming in and they are taking trees, they're pruning them improperly, they might still be alive, but they've taken away a lot of the integrity and the purpose and the value of those trees. Big change coming up now is when you're on page 13, starting at section line number 512, is permit requirements. We heard clearly from the boards coming forward, and we heard clearly from the commission that there was concern that the requirement to get a permit was becoming overburdensome for some of the property owners. So what we have done is said that a landscape permit, and we defined what that is required for all new construction projects, or if the expansion or renovation that you're working on is 50%. In the previous code, in the beginning, we took out was 25%. We bumped it up to 50% of the cost or the assessed value of the property, or if you're expanding the footprint by 50%. So if you have a house and your house is worth $100,000 and you're doing $50,000 or more worth of work, we said, yeah, you know what? At this point, it's worth it. You're putting that kind of money into your home, hire a professional, and let's get the landscaping up to code. And that's when that permit is triggered. Another big change, it might seem minor, it's a big change, but in the past we said that it must be signed and sealed by a registered landscape architect, and we're simply saying follow the state statute and anyone authorized to do them by the state, so we're not so restrictive as to which design professionals can prepare these plans. We then reorganized and cleaned up the plan section that goes all the way through page 14 for you. You'll see at the bottom of 14 on into 15, a lot of language has been taken out, and that has all been moved up and cleaned up and reorganized in that section to clearly delineate how to prepare a plan and what is to be shown on a plan. Next couple of pages, there's a lot of what we call cleanup language.
What page are you on?
On page 16 now. If you go to on page 16, starting at line 643, we want to ensure that in the tree protection area that we are looking at in the site design requirements, we're looking at ensuring that all the appropriate techniques and protection techniques are put in place when you're planting and putting trees in. And we even say that a tree protection plan may be required. If you're required to put a tree in, we want to make sure that the tree stays, lives, and does as the purpose of that planting. Yes. So a big change now on same page 16, going down to line 659. One of the discussions and one of the recommendations that came out of the tree board is to increase the percentage of required trees to be South Florida native from 50% to 75%. So that might be one I'm looking for guidance from this board, this commission on, is how you feel about that and where you want to go with that, okay? On page 17, we're now getting into landscape design standards, subsection K. A common standard in the landscape world for down here is Florida Friendly Landscape Principles. So we have brought that, clarified that in this ordinance as to what that means. In this section, there was several things that were of concern. Subsection C of this chapter, or this section under line 696, previously said that a soil analysis was required. And again, both boards and this commission asked the question, why are we requiring property owners to go through and have all their soil tested? So we changed that from required to as a suggestion. If you're investing in that, it's probably a good idea, but it's no longer a requirement to go through and have your soil tested. Under installation and trees, there's a lot of language being added, but a lot of that is just from our side, is a lot of cleanup, a lot of clarification of language. I wouldn't say, unless you want to have any specific questions, there's not a lot of substantive changes in that section. Oh yeah, okay, thank you. Page 18, number 5 on line 748. A issue that we deal with all the time, and I'll steal from every public utility across the U.S., is the right tree in the right place. And as we are looking at where we locate our trees, we want to make sure that we are not coming in conflict with any utility easements, be it above ground or below ground. Because anyone who's dealt with utilities and dealt with areas and storms, when you have trees going up into wires, you get high winds, it takes them down. You get tree roots that go under, and they can wreak havoc in underground utilities. So we want to be painfully clear that the location of these must be complying with any existing utilities above or below ground. The next section is really getting into the different definitions. A lot of this is cleanup language. We did have a long discussion when we brought the LDRs forwards on hedges and hedge heights. So we brought that clarification into this as well, and grasses and turf grasses. Again, a lot of cleanup language. Under section L on
I'm
page...
sorry, could you go back to hedge heights? Where's
Absolutely.
that? 772?
Yep.
What does it say? What was the change? Minimum of 18 inches?
So going down from requiring them to be 2 feet at height and when they're planted down to 18 inches. Dave and I had this discussion. We could probably even go lower than that. If you're going to a greenhouse or a landscape company, quite often you're buying a very nice hedge and it's not going to be 2 feet tall. It just seemed like that regulation was excessive at the time of planting. Too many shrubs come in, they're probably even 12 inches is high.
What about maximum height?
36. Line 777. If you do yours for screening, attain a height of, when hedges are used for screening, attain a height of 36 inches, except where providing adequate and safe site distance requires them to be maintained at 30-inch height. So for instance, for along a major thoroughfare, they have to be 36 inches, except in the visibility triangle where they have to be 30 inches.
Okay. but not on other, just in the main thoroughfares.
Just really anywhere, but it's just giving you an example.
So a resident can't have a hedge higher than 3 feet?
No, they must be allowed to get that tall. So they have to be, that's like the minimum sizes.
It's not a maximum. It's not a maximum. height.
There
You
is
can't-
no
that's-
maximum.
that's
Okay,
not a
because we were
maximum
talking about the
height.
shielding of boats and all the other,
No,
I'm thinking,
no,
how does
no,
this?
there is,
Yeah, yeah.
there is no
fall in?
maximum. So
We're talking about
they should
people-
be allowed to get to 36 inches, 3 feet tall,
Mm-hmm.
except where they're in a visibility triangle and they should be at 30
Okay.
inches.
Okay,
There
thank
is no
you.
maximum height in this ordinance.
Okay.
And on that note, as a public safety issue, I think we need to look at, if you drive around town and Commissioner Ambrose
We
and
were
I
out there,
just dropped there on Tuesday, we have issues where people have planted hedges right up to the intersections and you pull out, it's difficult to see around. So that is one thing that we want to take note of, because that's a public safety issue.
If you see I had the whole visibility triangle on the corner, you know,
Right.
we're not allowed to plant anything on that corner.
Right, and we need to enforce that and be consistent with that across the city, because that is a safety issue. On the next page, page 20, you're going down to line 825. We get into the irrigation requirements. The initial section, we have taken that out. If you go down to page 21, you'll see that we have put back in a better, we believe, a better irrigation section for us to look at. It does require that irrigation be put in the appropriate places, so that we're all clear. There is an exemption for single-family residential homes from this section, okay? So we're talking about multifamily, the apartments and/or commercial industrial parcels. We want to make sure that their irrigation systems are put in and installed properly and meet these
I was
criteria.
gonna say, what about if it's zero escaped?
Yes, I believe that's also. an
It's
exemption.
also just, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that starts at line 928, exceptions. And irrigation of existing plant communities, newly established native plant areas, or single-family residential or occupied duplexes are exempt.
Okay. Thank you. I didn't see that one.
In the next section down, section M in tree preservation, starting at line 946, we have a lot of the initial language is a lot of cleanup language, ensuring that we're measuring consistently. You'll see on the next page, page 24, there was stuck in the middle of the code another section talking about the applicability. We've taken that out. It's not needed here. The other language on these pages here are just a lot of cleanup and clarification language for the code. On the next page, page 25, if you jump down to line 1050, you'll see a new one being added, subsection E on exemptions. We've talking with Public Works, we want to ensure that our crews have the ability to go through and maintain public right-of-ways without having to come in and get permits for that. We see a need to ensure that the public right-of-ways are kept and maintained and clean. So on city land, city right-of-ways and easements, the city has the right to go in and plant, prune, and maintain as needed to ensure the public safety and the public right-of-ways. That wasn't expressly written that way. We just want to make sure it's clear in the code that way. If you go on to the next page, page 26, dropping down to line 1098, we're now looking at the section on relocation and replacement of trees. This is the section that we went through and discussed quite extensively, and have just taken that section and just cleaned it up. The removal and replacement of trees is something that we deal with quite often in the city, and Dave wanted to recommend this language to clean it up. Anyone jumping on this?
Yeah, we did remove the requirement to a one-for-one replacement on prohibited or nuisance trees. So if you have an Australian pine, you want to remove an Australian pine, by code, you don't have to put anything in. Some people thought that was a disincentive to remove a tree. An invasive tree is to have to plant a new tree.
Going on, trying to see the next section we made significant changes to.
I think that's it.
The last big section that we reorganized is grouping together all the enforcement and penalties sections to the end of the ordinance. So we moved them all down into one area. We have put in clarification on the table that exists now on the penalties. I'm on page 31. You'll see the penalties for tree abuse and removal without a permit. We've consolidated all these appeal sections and the enforcement sections all into the same area. Appeals at the very end of the ordinance is all underlined because that's been moved from two different sections, consolidated and made into one set of language. Again, over time, there was two different sections in there and the appeals were very similar, so we simply, working with our attorney's office, just brought them down into one section as a clarification. So it's not really new language, it's just taking the two sections, consolidating them down together and making it clear. So I'll turn, yeah.
We did remove board times.
Oh, in the previous version we had brought before you, we had looked at adding a section of allowing the Planning and Zoning Board or the Historic Preservation Board to assess fines for people. We used the language that was similar to the Historic Preservation language that we had brought forward earlier, but both of the boards and this commission both had concerns about those boards levying fines. Have gone back to what's in the code currently. So we've taken that section out of the previous version we brought forward to you last time.
Okay.
I think that's the changes that we have. I'd now turn
Vice
back over to
Mayor?
you.
Okay, I have some comments, starting with page 4, where it says federal highway from south city limit to south boundary of College Park. Is that a typo?
No, and William may want to jump in on this. It's looking at where the major thoroughfares start and stop, and at that point, going further north, it becomes more of a residential area. So the major thoroughfare designation stops at that point.
What would be
On
the
north side.
south boundary of College Park and not north boundary?
The north boundary is the.
City line.
Spillway.
The city limit.
Why
And
wouldn't
the southern
you
one
go
is like
to
right
this?
before that curve is like at 23rd,
It's like
maybe.
Wellesley.
Why wouldn't you go all the way up to the north end?
Well, keep in mind that the major thoroughfares, I mean, there's a guidelines for it,
Okay.
really talk about things other than single-family residential. And from that curve up, it's single-family residentially zoned. Most of the activities that can happen, since you're in a historic district on one side and you're not on the other, but the character is completely different from any other portion of a major thoroughfare in the city. We can be preferable to treat that portion as we would major rights-of-way in any residential area versus trying to impose on that specific stretch of road the major thoroughfare restrictions, which will get quite involved. And the atmosphere has been established in Lake Worth probably 25 years or so that there was a distinct difference between the north part of Federal Highway at that point and the southern portion.
Okay. My next question is, I don't see anything about Roundup or pesticides. Why is that? And, I think we need to start looking at that, especially on our own public spaces, beach complex, golf course, eliminating Roundup and or, pesticides, and in our local gardens. I mean, as we talk about the water tables and things in other meetings, we haven't talked about any of the pesticides, Roundup or anything.
Pesticide application is governed by state law, by the Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, FDACS, Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, and it's also governed by federal law. Federal law basically is the label is the law. You have to apply the pesticide as it is listed on the label. So if the label says 1 ounce per gallon, that's the max you are allowed to use. So it would be really redundancy. I mean, we could try and reduce it or encourage reduction.
Can we do it in our own spaces? Can we not use Roundup? Can we stop using the pesticides in our own?
That would be a question more for public services. We don't, community sustainability doesn't do the maintenance. They have looked into it before, and there's not really a effective bulk chemical that will do the same job as Roundup that is cost effective. That's really a question for public services. They're the ones
Okay.
that apply that on city property. And then homeowners are still required, if they buy it from Home Depot, they're still required to do what the label says. We're not the enforcement arm of that. That would be the Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services.
Okay, I'll take that up with them.
Okay.
Mark answered a few of my questions earlier. Now, we are not going to go down the street and duplexes and other people that do not fall into this category. We're not going to start citing them. It's only on new and/or 50% prompted. So things that are out there that look beautiful, we're not going to knock on their door and say, because you don't meet our current code, you need to change it.
The yes, in general, the only ones that we are still in looking at is the requirement that your front yard be a certain percentage of hardscape versus landscape. And we've had recent violations of people paving over a significant portion of their properties. That we still look at. From the code enforcement perspective, we still look at the maintenance of properties. If weeds getting too tall, dead plants and stuff like that, we still would be looking at that. I want to be clear.
I personally don't have a problem with curb appeal, but what comes to mind is the beautiful location, which is an office on the corner of 9th Avenue North and Federal. And it's an office, I think it's a law office now, and they have a huge rock garden in front. It's beautiful. I would hate for us to knock on their door and tell them that because, you know, their, in essence, front yard is a beautiful rock garden, that it no longer falls.
That's not currently addressed in this version of the code. The code does say that the remainder must be planted in living ground cover. The mulch section was increased from 25% to 50%. We can look at language that allows rock in limited areas. You know, you talked about Roundup and chemicals. Rock gardens like that are chemically dependent. You know, unless someone's out there pulling weeds all the time, most of what they do is they spray the weeds.
Well, I get that.
Okay.
But
So if
I'm,
that's
I'm
what we're
trying
looking at.
not to
I understand.
go out and cite people that have beautiful and then have them,
As far as I know, no one has ever been cited for rock in their yard.
Okay, but I have had other issues. I just use that because that was
Yes.
the first one, but I have had other issues where they have been cited.
And I have looked into that, and I've got some ideas that I can talk with Mark to bring forward. Just limiting the amount and where it's at. I would prefer to have mulch around trees because it
agreed.
provides nutrients. So just maybe not the entire, but a percentage, maybe 50% can be rock. You know, we could work
And
on
I'm
language
just
for
use
that.
them. I have no
I
problem.
understand.
With mulch
I know
other,
exactly that
other
example. I know exactly what you're
forms.
talking about. I know that location.
The other question I had was communication. We've always had a bad communication problem with residents. How are we going to communicate these new ordinances and/or our existing ordinances for trees? A lot of times, you know, you have tree penalties for removing. A lot of times, it's a neighbor that alerts you to a tree being removed. How do you write a penalty on something after the fact? You know, especially if the tree's been removed. Sometimes we get lucky and we get there and the tree's laying in the front yard and you can measure the diameter. That's how I see you're measuring it. But what's the communication process with not only this, but Tree USA and all those other things that tell you what you should and shouldn't be doing, native plants versus, you know, others. Where's the communication pieces, or how are we going to communicate that?
Part of that is the Festival of Trees. It's coming up in February. We offer that information there. We can,
But
you know,
also a handful of people come versus
a couple
hand-
hundred.
Okay, but
You know,
a couple hundred
yeah.
and 38,000,
38,000.
you're not getting the message out.
So one of the
We
things
can look at
that
that.
you guys have brought to our attention on several occasions is this issue of communicating out. So we have increased our communications using the neighborhood associations. And so one of the things that we are doing now, and I'll say it's one of Alexis's key job, and the reason we brought her on is to build better relationships with our existing associations that can get this information out and disseminate it faster than sometimes we can. As a city as a whole, we are embarking on improving information dissemination through building a better website, making sure that information gets out. We can specifically, to answer your question on this ordinance, make sure that it's communicated out to people through the newsletter. We can make sure it goes out and through utility billing. We can always add, and that's a great way to get things out to everybody, is we can always have the option to put things in utility billing to get the information out. But communicating this board has made it very clear that when we make these types of changes, we want to make sure that it gets out to the people.
Like you referred in here to champion trees.
Yeah.
Who knows what a champion tree is? Okay, so if you don't know what a champion tree is, how do you find out what a champion tree is before you cut it down? Communication like that,
Right.
for instance. Two other things. On page, yeah.
Like the house on, what is it? Princeton in College Park. It looks like a little magical cottage and this giant banyan tree or fig, do you know?
Ficus or whatever's up there.
Whatever it is, it looks like a storybook. That house is for sale.
Okay.
So say somebody buys that house and says, well, it's hurricane season.
I wanna take that
tree could be really
Oh, I know which one
dangerous.
you're talking about. I've met with those people before.
Well, it's for sale again.
Okay. I don't know if they know. Hopefully they understand. We could communicate with them. I mean, it might not be a bad idea if we notice these big trees, and just let the people know. You know, I can knock on their door and say, hey, do you know that this tree is protected? The previous owners, or maybe the current owners, actually called me. I recommended they contact a certified arborist. They contacted an arborist who I happen to know. He called me and asked if we could meet. We went there. We explained everything to him, that the tree is structurally sound, that it really didn't need pruning other than a couple branches that were really close to the house. And I believe that's all they did. As far as I know, there's been no other trimming to that tree.
But the first owner actually during a storm, a tree limb went through the roof and in the child's bedroom.
But we have a lot of those trees around the city, and people coming from other states
May not know.
and
May not know those
countries may
things,
not
yeah.
know.
Points of
On-
That's a
information.
communication thing. We could figure out a way to communicate to those particular tree owners, that, you know, it's a significant tree, a remarkable tree, that, you know, is protected.
What's the definition of a champion tree?
Well, no, that's more of a specimen tree. Champion tree is considered the largest tree of its species in a particular area. So we only have one tree that has been designated a champion, and that's at the Banyan Court apartment complex. That's the only one. And we have 4 trees that are historic trees designated by this commission at City Hall Annex.
Okay.
So those are the only,
On page 20, line 822, vegetables and fruit gardens are allowed so long as the minimum landscape requirements are met. Okay, I'm a gardener, I plant it, but working with Dorothy Jacks, we came across a home that had taken their house off the tax rolls because they were growing gardens in their front and backyard, feeding people. Now, we need to be very careful how we write or what we allow, because the last thing I want is all these homes to be coming off the tax rolls because they have a certain garden.
is that in the city?
It's in the city on the north end and 19th. William's familiar with it. So, you know, just as a point of reference,
Okay.
you know, I don't need you to comment on it. I just need you to make sure
It's a
that,
different section of the code that needs to be addressed than the landscape code on that.
okay.
And again, we will continue to struggle with the property appraiser's office making decisions blind on properties in Lake Worth.
Last is, I'm glad that you changed he in front of the horticulturist, because someday our horticulturist may be a she.
One thing that the city attorney's office is hammering us on is gender neutral writing of code.
Thank you,
As they look
Christy.
at
Thank
Christie,
you, Christy.
every time we one slips by, they point it out. So we're trying to get that rid of out of all the codes.
When the city horticulturist find that it is requested to remove a tree and/or I didn't see anything in here, Mike and I had the conversation a long time ago when the tree in the plaza was taken down, that we needed to talk about issues. And I'm concerned that one person in any department, and we've had the conversation up here, could make the decision to take a tree down, remove a tree. Is it multiple people talking about those things, especially on city property?
I learned my lesson on that case, and if there's any significant tree that has to come down, Public Services is very good about contacting me when they have to remove a tree, or if they have to do major trimming to a tree. There was a tree at the Old Bridge Park that was severely leaning into the parking lot, that was obstructing traffic. So we went in there, it's a very old, green buttonwood. I went in there, met with them on Wednesday morning and went through, or Tuesday morning, on exactly what they should cut to maintain most of the tree, but still allow it
I
safe.
just want to make sure that we're clearly documenting it with multiple people, so things like that doesn't happen again. And then also, if there are trees on property and you request a removal or a non-removal, and then they come back to fight it with us, what the process is clearly with our attorneys and with our staff. Okay, that's all I've got. Thank you.
Commissioner Hardy?
Yes. I guess I'll give you kudos on two things. The 75% native requirements, kudos on that. Kudos also on something that nearly slipped me, and that would be page 20, lines 794, 797, excuse me, through 797, that no greater than 60% of single-family homes, duplexes, pervious lot area will be basically planted lawn grass. Good job there. And then three things, and I'll go backwards in terms of importance for me, least important to most important. Can we look at the definition of a small tree?
Yeah.
Okay. So it says here, small tree. Tree small. Any self-supporting perennial woody plant that attains a height of at least 10 feet in maturity and whose main stem attains a diameter of at least 3 inches at 4.5 feet above the ground and a minimum canopy at maturity of 10 feet. Okay. Can you give me an example of a small tree? Would a magnolia be a small tree?
No, that would be a
Okay,
large
that
or
would be a
medium
large
tree.
Okay.
Small tree would be something in the lines of soldier wood. They're very uncommon. They're not widely planted. Scrub bay, what
Like
you
an
got,
orange
Richard?
geiger?
Joe wood. There's quite a few. Geiger would probably be a medium tree.
Okay.
So you're not going to get a whole lot of small trees. We get mostly medium and large trees. It just allows small trees in certain circumstances. We have areas that you can't fit a medium or large tree. When it grows to maturity, it'll lean out. The mantra in horticulture or arborism is a leaning tree is a hazardous tree.
Right. So I just want to say, when this goes through, I want it to be really clear to our contractors who are doing the road work that when they plant these like magnolias that are as tall as I am, that have the where the trunk is like this thin, that they need to step that up, because the requirement for a magnolia, which is a medium tree,
Medium to large, depends on the species.
medium to large, is larger than that, and I just want to make sure
Okay.
I find
That,
the right.
I'll
what's
talk
the-
with
what's the
public
requirement
services
after
about
medium?
that because they spec that.
Yeah,
That's-
they're small and
They are
thin.
smallish, yes.
Yeah.
Sometimes we can't get the tree that big. The nurseries don't grow them. Part of the reason for this change was to come more in line with the, what's called the Florida Grades and Standards. So it sets standards for nurseries to grow trees. So there's Florida Fancy, Florida #1, Florida #2, or Cull. The only two allowed to be planted really anywhere are Florida Fancy and Florida #1. Almost every community specs Florida #1 or better. Florida #2, it's considered a tree that has quite a few amount of defects and requires a lot of work to get it to a #1. So a #1 is a straight trunk, has a good well-formed canopy, even distribution of branches, no large holes. You don't have like a big gap in the middle of it. A Florida #2 would have a big gap, maybe a dog leg at the bottom. It's very technical. And so most nurseries grow to the Florida #1 standard.
I just want to make sure that our city actually follows this code as the road bond is being implemented and as we're planting trees throughout the city.
I'll speak with public services and make sure that's in their contract language, that it has to be Florida #1 and comply with our code.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
The other thing, let's talk about landscape values and permitting, which we will find. I got me. Okay, on page, what is this? 13, lines 512 beginning. Right, and so the issue that I have with this, I understand that you're stepping around a controversy from the previous meeting, right? Previously, we were going to require you to get a permit if you're doing landscape work of a value of what, $5,000?
Yeah.
Okay, and the concern was that would draw in too many people, right? And that too many people would have to then come in and get a permit. And that the permitting process, which is very well spelled out here, requires you to do things that an average person can't do. You're gonna have to hire a professional, whether it's a certified landscape, whatever.
Actually, not actually.
Okay.
That's why we put in the chapter 481 of the state of Florida statutes. Chapter 481 has about 10 or 12 exemptions, and one of the exemptions is owner occupied. You can design your own landscape. As
Okay.
long as it has everything on here, clearly drawn, everything's on here
Drawn
that
to
I
scale?
need. Excuse me,
Drawn to
to scale.
That's
Ish,
okay.
yeah, ish,
I was gonna say that's
ish.
pretty hard
I mean,
for
if
me.
it's, yeah, and I agree with you on that.
Yeah.
That would probably be the hardest part if you draw it to scale. But as long as it has all the information, and most cases, if it's that type of application where they're bringing a landscape up to code, or they have they're having an issue, I go look at it in advance and to see if they even need to meet the landscape code. They may already meet or exceed it, and so this doesn't matter. If you go to a certain yard and it has all the trees and all the hedges and meets everything on the residential requirement, that it doesn't, they already meet all the standards. We can't make them do more than the minimum.
So my question is, now I want you to imagine a home of a certain value. Okay, let's say you have a home of $100,000 value, and you have a home of a $400,000 value, right? You can do the same amount of work on the $400,000 home as you would on the $100,000 home, and potentially have to get a permit for the same work at the $100,000 home, whereas you would not have to get a permit on the $400,000 home because the $400,000 home is worth more. And the requirement to get a permit here is based on the value of the house. So one might imagine, for example, a home on Lakeside would not have to get a permit for the same work that a home on F Street or C Street or D Street or B Street or H Street.
Understood, but the only time that's triggered is when they expand it by more than 50%,
Right.
or they do a renovation. So if the $100,000 home is adding, double or
50%.
50% of their square footage, they're going from 1,000 square feet to 1,501, then they're supposed to bring it up.
Is it based on square footage, or is it doing any renovation that would increase the value of the home by?
It's
or that would
both
improve
the
improve
appraised value
Right.
and or increasing the footprint.
No, increasing the footprint or increasing the. I'm sorry, you said the appraised value.
If the work being done based on 50% of the appraised value, or if you're expanding the footprint by 50%. So those are the two thresholds we look at.
Okay, and so how do we determine, or perhaps it's the property appraiser, how does the property appraiser determine that a certain group of renovations that someone's doing would increase the value of the property by 50%? Is it based on the amount of money that the person is putting into the property, or is it based on some sort of appraisal
They don't-
methodology?
The property appraiser doesn't set that. So the way that works is if someone comes in with a permit and they say the job is worth $50,000.
Right.
The building permit.
The building, for the building permit.
So-
They say, one second, please.
Okay.
They say the job is worth $50,000. So the first thing I do is I go to the property appraiser website and I look at the improvement value. The code is specific on the improvement value, so only the value of the structure, not the land, not anything else. So I look at the improvement value. So your $400,000 home, the improvement value may only actually be $200,000. So it's a little bit less. So it's not as high of a threshold as it appears. So that's the first thing I do. So if it is less, if it triggers that, then the next step is before I even contact them, I go out to the property and see if it meets or exceeds the code. If it meets or exceeds the code, I don't even bother calling them. If it doesn't, then there's a landscape stop that's put in our Naviline system, and that triggers that they have to come in and get a permit. Most cases, it's very minimal. Most yards have some landscape, so they meet some of the requirements.
So I guess my question, my feeling is I don't like the fact that the requirement here is based on the value of the property
Of
as
the
opposed to
improvements.
of the improvement, sure. The value of the improvement value of the property, rather than just the value of the work being done. It would set a standard that would not necessarily, well, there's a standard, but people could be doing the same work in different parts of the city and it have a different requirement that would affect them. But I will move on from that.
Well, hang on, question.
Sure.
I mean, because you brought it up.
Yeah.
What number would you recommend? What's the threshold? What's the trigger?
I liked having an absolute value for the amount of work that were done. I understand it's controversial, but I would this to me is more controversial than having an absolute dollar value for the amount of landscape.
probably, if it happens a dozen times a year, that's a lot. It's very rare that this gets triggered, to be perfectly honest. I look at, when I see it come in, when I do see a major improvement, it's very rare that it happens.
Why did you change it from the 5,000 to the 50% of the improved value?
50% was it used to always be 25%.
Right.
And we increased it to 50% to become in line with the Florida Building Code, which states the same thing. If you do 50% improvements to the renovations of the property, you have to bring it up to the existing code. So we're trying to match the Florida Building Code, and we removed the 5,000 because that was very unpopular with both boards and this commission. So we're looking for a number.
Well, I think that the problem is anytime you create a mandate of any kind, you're gonna have people, you're gonna have special circumstances when
I
you
agree.
create a rule of that nature.
The goal has been to try to have some consistency so every application does not become an administrative and staff nightmare. We are doing, under the Florida Building Code, substantial improvements, changes of use and occupancy, and the the Federal Emergency Management Act flood requirements stipulate when you consider a substantial improvement. So we're having in line, if you're substantially improving your home under whatever category, you're also going to bring your house up to the landscape code. And so that's very easy. That is determined by the building official usually. If it's a substantial improvement or a change of occupancy, and then it goes to Dave, and so that works in sync.
I don't disagree that someone doing substantial work to their property should have to bring the property up to code. I guess what I disagree with is the standard that we use here to determine what substantial means. And I would rather
The argument should be taken to the Florida building officials.
I understand what the Florida but I would rather some sort of scheme like what you had before. That's all. I've actually really got to go to the bathroom, so I'd prefer to move on. I'm going to stop drinking water before these meetings going forward. The last thing,
Point of order, city manager.
Please don't make me laugh right now. So, and I'll just go here to page 8. Okay. And there's the highlighted portion that has been stricken for this. I can't call it a reading, but for this workshop. Okay. Now I'm going to ask staff a series of questions.
Yep.
All right. If I'm building a single-family home brand new, do I have to put a shade tree in the front yard? Yes or no?
Yes.
Okay. Am I allowed to substitute palms for the shade tree right now?
Under the current language, if you can.
Sort of.
Sort of. You need-
And that is because that no more than 20% of the required trees may be palms.
Right.
So, and the only way palms that count as a required tree is if it's a royal palm, sable palm, or coconut palm planted in a cluster of 3.
Right.
That rarely happens, and I'll explain why. A single oak tree is, for instance, worth $500. You know, you buy it for $500, get it installed. A single palm tree is valued at $300. So I'll get plans all the time that show a line of palm trees. And I'll say, well, you can't have more than 20%, so as long as it's no more than 20%, they're allowed currently. And the code says you have to have 3 palms instead of 1 palm. Every single time I say that, it's shade trees.
Right.
Because it costs more.
Fantastic.
So it's cost prohibitive generally, but yes, I'd have to look at it a little, but I think, yes, they could do it if it meets the code, if it's no more than 20% the required trees.
Okay, and if it's a larger single-family home, you would have to plant potentially 2 shade trees or more than 1 clustering of 3 of those.
It's
specified
based on the
palm
square
trees.
footage.
Based on the
of
square
prop-
footage of the
property.
of the lot.
The lot.
Right, okay.
So 2,500 square feet, every 2,500 square feet, you're supposed to have a shade tree or an equivalent to a shade tree, which would be 3 of those specific palms, not to exceed 20%.
Okay, so what I'll say here is that there's an inconsistency, right? Because I can think of a development near here that was not required to plant any shade trees along their frontage. Am I right in saying that there's something that applies to people building single family homes that does not apply to people building other things?
Not necessarily. That particular instance, the developer came to us and said that they wanted to be consistent with the way this frontage is, the medjool palms along in front of City Hall and along both ends of Dixie Highway. And through a discussion we had with staff, We felt that their application was appropriate and it kept that same look that we already have.
So I guess, my question is,
Need some water?
I need water right now.
That's
It's
a
hard
section
for
I
me to
can
read.
look at, and I did do some stuff this afternoon, looking at that.
I would just like for this stricken part to be unstricken, because it's pretty clear to me that we probably shouldn't allow palm trees to count as shade trees, especially along right of way, right? It's
I agree with that.
There's an inconsistency, and in addition to that, there's a value that shade trees provide that palm trees do not, and that value is like really important to the city. And what I said last night at Historic Resources Preservation Board is, there are people who are investing in this city who know that this city is something great because it's the last affordable, walkable city in coastal Palm Beach County. And my belief is that we should be doing absolutely everything that we can to enhance that walkability, right? And this isn't, as some people have said, some distraction from other important things. My opinion is that it's not a distraction. It's like something very important. Here's one of our greatest assets that when people come around here, it's not like, our downtown is not like, there's a downtown in a northern Palm Beach County city that's more of a mall, right? That's not what our downtown is. Our downtown is authentic. It's authentic. It's walkable, and we should be doing our best to enhance that everywhere. And I would like to see that reflected in our code. And by the way, we already require people to plant trees in their frontage. I don't see why we can't require or be specific about the type of tree we want them to plant. There are all sorts of things throughout this code where we're very specific about what people are allowed to plant where. But when it comes to shade trees along public right of way, we say too much government. Some people do. So I would like us to entertain unstriking these. And I don't know how my colleagues feel about that, but I certainly would like to hear how they would feel about that.
So let's be clear, this is why we're here tonight, is to
Right.
get direction from the commission. So I'd like to hear from the commission, guide us, and we'll bring back what's.
Well, we need to hear from every member of the commission, so I'm gonna move on to Commissioner Robinson.
Thank you. Just quickly, are you consulted before the Public Works, the specs are written for the road bond?
Generally, yes, they don't necessarily always consult me on size, they always consult me on species, what I recommend.
Let's get through
And
this.
most of the time, majority of the time, I always recommend natives, due to their durability and their sustainability and all that. Generally, our old code was inconsistent with the Florida grades and standards that I said earlier. And that's why we dropped the sizes down a little bit, because that's what the nurseries grow to. They grow to that specific standard. And so if we have a 12-foot tall tree and every nursery grows that 3-inch caliper tree at 10 feet tall, then they can't find that tree. It's just not available.
And the road bond is being treated differently or just the same?
I don't know. I don't know how they spec those trees. I think it's based on,
Well,
honestly, based on
That's my
budget.
concern, is that you,
That's a public services question.
I feel that,
If you're making rules that the city needs to adhere to, then why wouldn't our own projects, that was gonna be my question. Why are we not following our own rules? And why are you not working together with Public Works to make those things happen?
We generally do. I can make sure I work with them more. I'll talk with Felipe and Jamie and make sure that they spec the proper size trees.
good, thank you. And so then that goes to bulb outs and
Yes.
how we're gonna treat those in the future. And
That's not specifically mentioned in the code, anything about bulb
no,
outs.
but the
if
road
we
bond
plant-
is, and I'm,
If we
if
plant
we're
a tree and
talking
a bulb out, it
trees,
should be.
we could be talking bulb outs and trees.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, if we have a bulb out there, we're gonna plant a tree and it should be the size requirement we would make it.
And we have no requirements for, just trying to move along. The vacant lots, a lot of vacant lots on South Federal Highway and elsewhere, can we incentivize planting on those
The
lots somehow?
difficulty with that, and we ran into it at the one project, is that there was a previous code years and years ago, I forget what year it was, I found it, I tracked it down, that required trees to be planted along the perimeter. It was quite a few years ago, 7 or 8 years ago. And okay, longer than that. And that was the only property that it was applied to. They actually required to put in irrigation, put in bahia sod, and put in those trees. which was great while it was vacant. Well, when it came in, based on the preservation ordinance,
And we had to preserve them.
they had to preserve
Yeah.
them, so they moved all those trees to the back. In order to fit them in the back, they had to kind of base prune them and really do to fit them in there.
So
They preserved them, but would we better off, if they planted smaller, high-quality trees in the back? So
Well,
then it creates an issue on, are we gonna encourage development by them having, a lot that they can build on, or have them plant a whole bunch of trees that they're gonna have to preserve somewhere?
Can't we do both? Encourage planting until development and then not,
That's up to you guys, really. That was the vacant lot ordinance that went really south.
well, I haven't given up on it.
Okay.
And I hope you don't. And
No,
hope staff-
if you
staff-
guys give us direction that that's what you want, then we'll put it in the ordinance.
Good. Look forward to it.
Me too.
The right-of-ways, public right-of-ways, the ability for neighbors to access or maintain or do any work on the right-of-ways.
That's outside of the scope of this section right
Okay.
here. so-
Well, actually, it does, somewhere in there it says you can't cut down trees on public right-of-ways. We discourage that because we've had issues, especially on South Palm Way.
Well, maybe not trees, but shrub, overgrowth.
Really, anything.
main-
We should have control over what happens in our right-of-way.
Okay.
We've had, and I'll explain the issue. They planted what's called a voodoo palm, and they have spines that are like this long, covering the entire palm tree. They planted that in the medium, like 3 feet from the side of the medium, the medium strip. We went in and took it out because it's a hazard. It's not the right tree.
Good.
So it goes back to right tree, right place. What if someone decides to plant a nice tree in the median and they put the tree in the visibility of shrubs in the visibility triangle so that people are crossing that road in that line of sight? It puts the liability on us if they put a plant that causes an accident and we don't do anything about it, or we allow, it gets too high, all that stuff. So
Well, besides the median, just other right-of-ways that are overgrown. Does this restrict the possibility of artificial turf on our public fields?
No,
playing field?
well, the ordinance does not speak to artificial turf at all.
So
I did another thing I looked at today was artificial turf. 2 communities, one directly north, one directly south, both allow artificial turf. The one to the north does not allow artificial turf in the front or side setbacks, and it's very specific on where it can be.
I'm really talking about parkland. Playing
Parkland,
fields.
in those particular ordinances, it does allow it in park fields. Artificial turf isn't always the best thing. There are severe disadvantages. It requires a lot more maintenance than you really know about, and they can be really hazardous. There's a lot of communities that have put in artificial turf that have removed them due to injuries. Have you heard of turf toe in the NFL? Or the artificial turf is not very giving, so if you plant your foot and your body keeps going, you'll tear out your knee. So at least regular turf, you'll slide a little bit. It's really a safety thing. That's up to you guys and leisure services if they want to get something in there that allows
But it doesn't restrict,
It
at this
doesn't
point.
specifically allow or restrict
Okay,
on
that's it.
public
Good.
lands.
Thank you.
You're
Good
welcome.
job for making it
Pro Tem?
clean and simple.
Thank you.
I want to thank you, staff, for bringing this back and giving us another bite at the apple and taking a look at this. And I'm looking forward to adopt it as written. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
My last question is just, no disrespect, but I feel like I'm at a condo association meeting. I mean, I understand, my first question is the city going to practice what it preaches? That's what I wrote down. Because, we cite people for what their property looks like or what they're doing wrong, and then we're doing the same thing in other places. Forget our sign, I won't even bring up our sign ordinances.
Do you have a specific example?
Well, I'm saying, on our city land, are we gonna maintain the same things that we're gonna go out and attract are we at this 75% natives? I just feel like from a commercial construction development business or whatever to come and mandate that you have to do boom, 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 and boom. I get that it's new construction, it's new whatever. We have a lot of residents that
Oh,
live,
thanks.
you know, a lot of people you mentioned earlier, Commissioner Hardy, you know, that they feel like, hey, I live in my house, I bought my house, I bought these trees, I want it to look like that. I think a lot of people feel more concerned is, does the house look nice? Is it well kept? Is it clean? Is it kept up? Is it maintained? I think neighbors prefer that as to, excuse me, but do you have 75% native trees in your yard? You know, I sort of feel a little bit like I'm in a Twilight Zone episode today, just because, you know, I think we're trying to clear crap up throughout the neighborhoods and things that are going on and practices that are happening, and now we're telling people what tree they can plant or not plant and what they have to do, and I don't know, it just sounds very involved. Now, from our perspective as a city, we should be doing those things. We should have restrictions for commercial development and things and projects that come in and new developments that come in. Like, I'm for that and for those types of things, but I really feel like if we're going to be doing any enforcement in the single-family communities of people and existing things, I understand, you know, my husband made a big mistake on our property in 2002. A tree was falling down. That's why when the other one got sick, I called you up right away and said, come check out this tree and see if it's okay. But not everybody would do that. And had he not made that mistake, we wouldn't have known to do that. So there is an education process, and I'd hate us to start enforcing anything before we had a chance to properly educate people in a major way. Because they're gonna, you know, we were talking about, you know, not requiring grass in empty lots because of the requirements of it and the watering requirements. We were emphasizing xeriscaping just 10 years ago, a former commissioner talking about that. You know, a lot of people haven't put grass on their properties because of whatever, they have hardscaped or not so much concrete, but what is it, pervious?
Yeah.
You know,
Pavers and stuff,
we'll
yeah.
put pavers and things like that to clear up for less maintenance to do it, and also less water requirements. We're talking about, we can't keep talking about less water requirements and then telling them they have to plant this. I mean, I just sort of feel I feel kind of big brothery in the plant world or something, you know, about doing it. I think that we should have these restrictions in place for the city, for its applications, for new development, for new construction. But I think we're gonna have issues if we really start going around enforcing it in a residential application. I think, you know, as long as someone maintains their property, it looks good. It looks like, hey, I lost half my hedge line around my house when the hurricane came through, and you know, I went out and I wanted to buy Clusia. I was gonna put Clusia up and put it up, and my husband said, no, you're not. It's not native. So I went with the Simpson stopper, right? It's
Good job.
It's still this
Thank you.
stupid big.
They grow slow.
And I got a hole for a year and a half now, and I still have my neighbors staring into
Should
my
have gone
yard.
with cocoa plum.
Huh?
Cocoa plum grows faster, similar leaf texture as the Clusia.
But that was, you know, that was the
Yeah,
whole
yeah.
privacy in my yard, and I was a year and a
Call me
half. I'm
next
still
time.
sitting here with this Simpson stopper that I'm like, it's like the Charlie Brown Christmas tree. But I don't know. That's just my personal opinion on it, and we've all had our chance to weigh in on it. So I appreciate staff doing this. Thank you very much. And we've got some cards here. I didn't open it up for conversation, but since we have so many, let's do it. It came in this way. Let's see. Ann Fairfax? Yes. Come speak here. And we don't answer you back, just so you know, so just make your comments straight too. And direct before it's me. Thank you.
She has no mic.
Where's your mic? She needs a microphone.
Sorry.
Thank
Hey,
you.
Put it in the
We have a megaphone for you. It's a special megaphone.
Here we go.
That's my bad.
Hi, Ann Fairfax, 318 South J Street. I actually have two cards. So the first one, I came a little late, and you all were talking about Roundup. I don't know if you know it, but Roundup is just involved in this landmark lawsuit for $289 million. It causes Parkinson's. I've had two landscape architect friends who have gotten it. It's on its way out. I think we need to be serious about getting rid of it and just saying, yeah, I know weeds, I get it, but nothing works like Roundup. That's why it's a huge billion business. But so that I think that you know, we don't want to subject ourselves to that kind of liability in the future too, especially since the science is out that it is really harmful. Second short thing, driving around Dixie, it occurred to me we're trying to be walkable. We're trying to be encourage mobility, alternate mobility. I saw so many people sitting on these forlorn little bus stops today with no shade. If we have some kind of priority system that we are planting trees that are on property or encouraging it, we need shade trees at bus stops. That's it.
Thank you. Tammy Panza, followed by Richard Stowe.
I have sat here for the last half hour and was hearing you guys talk about the single-family home permit requirements for landscaping, and I was actually looking at that key changes that's been up there for the last half hour, and it says removed permit requirements for existing single-family homes. I initially wrote on my card that permit requirements should also be lifted for the detached duplex, i.e. granny flat. I don't want them sort of grandfathered into getting a permit to have landscaping. I just think it's, and Pam, what you said about HOA, I don't want to live in an HOA. That's why I live in Lake Worth. If I have my hedge at 29 inches or 28 inches and it looks good, then just leave me alone. Single family homes, detached duplex, something smaller. I can see apartment complexes, all of that. But I can't believe we sat here for an hour and talked about this. As long as it looks nice and it's reasonable and it's well kept, then leave us alone. Let us have our houses as we want them. Thanks.
Richard Stowe.
Richard Stowe, 414 North Federal Highway. Just a couple of comments. One is the discussion about palms. I like to, when I think about Lake Worth, I like to look about how we can differentiate ourselves from our competitors, and those are the other public corporations. And I'm going to mention a few of them: Palm Beach, West Palm Beach, North Palm Beach, Palm Beach Gardens. I think Lake Worth should take a direction of defining ourselves with native shade trees. And in regard to that, not very much is known about natives by most people. There is some cult followers of natives, the Native Plant Society, Audubon Everglades. There are groups, but I think the city should incorporate information about natives and native shade trees in their website. The discussion that took place earlier about small versus medium versus large, it wasn't an easy answer for our arborist. So we should carefully use, the city website to inform and educate the people. I mean, that's because you can always say, give someone a link and, hey, here it is. With regard to your personal yard, and just as far as a hedge, I would, for you, Mayor Pam, I would look at Jamaica caper. It's extremely fragrant and it works as a hedge.
Thank you. Anna?
And Dave is shaking his head. And Dave was shaking his head. But yeah.
Anna at 35 South J, number 15, Lake Worth, Florida 33460. I wanted to go over, I want to create a local tax for, more regional tax for cigarettes, taxing cigarettes and alcohol, just through my own research from.
Anna, I'm sorry to interrupt you, sweetie.
On the topic, okay, so
We have to stay on the topic, yeah.
659, I think we can stratify vertically and horizontally from the more commonplace botany than just small, medium, and large. I think we can stratify from kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, deciduous and evergreen, angiosperm and gymnosperm, perennials, biennials, and annuals, shrubs, trees, and flowers. Let's see, monocots and dicots. Monocots are 3-petal, fibrous, and parallel leaf. Dicots are, let's see, outbranching leaf vein systems. Dicots are outbranching leaf vein systems, 4 to 5 petals, and let's see, taproot roots. I think we can do more like commonplace, not the new bizarre system of life that is going back into strange times and stuff like that. Not the new sort of wrong life system, but the normal modern, postmodern kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species stratification. I guess that's just about 659 and different ways to stratify, etc.
Thank you.
Sure. All right.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right. I want to thank Commissioner.
I asked for a point of information earlier about glyphosate. Just a quick question, Michael. How long have I been on you about Roundup at the golf course and other recreational facilities?
Quite a while.
Quite a while, yeah. As in like summer of 2017, quite a while. So we don't use Roundup per se. We do use a little glyphosate at the golf course. It's Prosecutor Pro. Our contract with that particular vendor is up next year, I believe. But in addition to that, they're going to stop using it, and they're basically going to be phasing it out. So as of February, they won't be using it. I was told that they don't use a lot of it.
They don't at the
Right.
golf course.
Right. And also that the real problem is what we use various other places where we don't contract out the maintenance piece. And the real problem is you obviously don't want areas to be weedy, but you don't have the manpower to stop and pull every weed in the city throughout. It's not, you're talking 7 square miles, but then you have to think about the linear miles that you would have to do that on. And so it's the most efficient way to kill the weed without having to hire an army of people to blanket the city to pull the weed. So we're gonna have to, if we are serious about stopping, the use of glyphosate, we're basically gonna have to have a discussion about what level of service and what level of personnel we want to have handling our public areas. And that's a discussion that I'm willing to have, but it goes hand in hand, right? So there's that. The other thing is, on that, Jupiter passed not too long ago an ordinance basically banning pesticide and herbicide use, and I believe fertilizers during the rainy season. During the rainy season. That's very interesting, especially for a city like Jupiter. Obviously, the water is very important to them. And so staff has been looking into that issue, into that particular ordinance at my direction. And I'm interested to see if basically the same could be done here. So
We actually brought that up, probably the whole Roundup thing Commissioner Amoroso brought to our attention, it was probably almost 7 years ago.
Yeah.
And that was why the golf course is utilizing less and less. When we actually did the resodding and brought in an outside landscape company, that was actually part of our,
When we negotiated
something that we
with-
negotiated with him, exactly. So I just want to give him kudos for that, because he's been very forward-thinking coming to that. The one thing I didn't ask you before was the 50% rule. Is that if you're doing it all at the same time, or if you're, say, like, I just think about myself, and I use my own examples not because I like to talk about myself, but because I've had the experience of going through you guys. I applied for 13 projects simultaneously on my house, but yet I didn't do all those 13 projects at the same time. It took me years to do some of them. Do you tally it up, and when you hit a certain mark?
Who believes
Just
you?
on your property.
In general, we
Just
do.
on mine, yeah.
In general, we look at it on an annualized basis and then keep track of if someone is progressively inching toward a substantial improvement by doing incremental permits that are spaced by 6 months, 8 months,
Well,
whatever.
it was money, we had to save up money to do the next project.
It can cause a problem.
Okay. All right, and I think too, I want to say, despite my comments before when I talked about on the residential side of it, our city, and Richard, you and I have talked many times about this, and me and my fragrant trees that I always talk about. Ever since I went to Chattanooga and they had those darn trees, and you went through and you'd get to different sections of town and you'd smell it. And I said, when we talk about having that experience in a city, that having that kind of smell and different when the hedges are blooming and different things are happening. So I love that to be incorporated into it. But I think that we need to look at any of the future projects we do on our main thoroughfares to have the whatever we choose has the root structure to be able, because we have such limited soil areas to plant certain types of things. So that needs to be looked at too, right? Wouldn't it?
Yeah, right tree, right place, and it doesn't just count for under power lines, utility easements, it's in right of ways. That's something that arborists look at is available root space.
Those Taba buoys that the FDOT, did FDOT plant those
Yes,
ones
they did,
along?
yes.
I made me crazy.
Yeah, and that's the,
They're beautiful certain times of the year.
yeah,
When
for
they're-
about 3 minutes.
Yeah.
They look
And is Royal Point Sienna, is that a shade tree or not? Sometimes.
Yeah, it gets,
Most of the year, yeah.
yeah, well, it gets large enough to be considered a shade tree. They don't provide a lot of shade because they have really tiny leaflets.
Oh, the canopies are beautiful.
Yeah, they
Magnificent.
are for a couple months when they bloom, and then during the winter they defoliate and they look dead.
And they end up in
And
the
I get-
pool and they look
I've
like
gotten
big giant
complaints,
stick farms.
Your tree is dead. The one on Federal at Blue Star Constitution Park. They get calls every year. Your tree is dead. I go out every year and I look at it and I go, no, it's alive.
It's sleeping.
All right. Well, thank you so much for what you do. And I just wanted to tell you too, remember that my,
Black olive.
it's alive. I nursed it back. It's living still.
Well, good luck, but
Can you believe it? I can't believe it. Yes.
Madam Mayor, can we take a poll on whether or not palm trees shall not be used as a substitute for required shade trees along public right of way?
It was already struck out.
I'm asking for a poll to be.
Well, it was struck out last time because I think we all agreed on it except for you. We had consensus on that. If you want to do, I'll take a name poll. Commissioner Robinson,
What's the question?
the question is, do palm trees count as shade
I got
trees?
it, I got it.
And it was a
I like-
3-2
I-
vote,
you
by
know,
the way.
Well, aesthetics count for something. And the right tree in the right place.
So,
Yes.
so what is the answer?
What-
Yes
what's
or
your
no?
answer? Yes or no?
Palm trees are angiosperms.
Quiet in the chambers, please.
Start at the other end of the,
she's working on it.
Isn't it groups of threes is
Yes,
how it
in groups
exists
of
right
three,
now?
yes. Currently, yes.
Okay, so
yes.
it's at groups of threes. It's not saying,
And it's
well,
very
I don't
rarely
think in public
used.
space, though, we're gonna do groups of three, though, are we?
Excuse me?
You could.
The question was public.
No,
No,
private.
it's private front
Are-
yards.
are
I have a
trees-
problem.
Are
No, I
trees,
thought-
no, public right of way. The question that Commissioner Hardy asked was,
It's public right.
should palm trees be allowed to be substituted for shade trees on public right of ways?
Define public right of way.
On the
Any street,
by the sidewalk.
Any street,
any
so
street or
any front
sidewalk.
yard that abuts a sidewalk.
correct,
So that's somebody's front yard.
Oh,
correct.
The question also is not whether they're allowed to plant
can we,
the palm.
excuse me, we're not going back and forth. You asked me to take a
Okay.
poll, we're taking a poll, and everyone's gonna be quiet while we take the poll. Commissioner Robinson, you're up.
damn.
Yes or no?
Why do you,
Because I called on you.
the,
Yes or no, sir?
we should be able to choose between what the arborist considers good or what the arborist considers good.
Yes or no?
Madam Mayor.
Yes.
Yes, okay, Commissioner, Vice Mayor?
Yes, you should be. What's the question?
This is silly.
I don't have a problem with you planting anything you want in your front yard.
So you're a no?
Okay, was that the question? I'm a no.
Yes, you're a no. I'm a no.
Yes, you should be allowed to plant palm trees in your front yard. No, the palm tree should not count as a shade tree ever because it's not actually a tree. right? I think we're confused here. The question isn't whether you're allowed to plant a palm tree. The question is whether, when you plant that palm tree, it counts as a shade tree.
It counts as a shade tree in a grouping of 3. That's what we
Wait,
clarified.
okay, so my answer is, I would like for it to be unrestricted, so I've apparently lost that battle.
Could you go back to Commissioner Robinson and ask him if he accepts the language as written, yes or no? Because I'm not quite sure I understood his answer.
I accept as written.
Commissioner Robinson?
We're accepting palm trees as an alternative to shade trees,
Clustered in 3.
clustered in 3. And the homeowner association, I think, as we're pretending we are now,
You're making me crazy.
let's see, it's a sort of a, I'm
To
willing to
replace a
accept.
shade tree.
Yeah, I'm willing to accept, and I can appreciate, I want to see shade trees
Yes.
wherever we can incentivize them to go. But I think that the homeowner has the right to beautify their property the way they choose.
Then you're a no.
Yes.
And I'm a no, I want to adopt it as written.
Okay. All right, there's your consensus.
Thank you.
All right, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn. Moved by Commissioner Hardy, seconded by Commissioner Maxwell. All of us in favor, state so by saying aye.
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 Thank you.
Votes, guys.
Starting it out.
Can't win.
Wow.